Ladies, gentlemen, and arisen of all ages, when it comes to Dragons Dogma 2, the myriad of playstyles is one of the coolest parts of the game, and mostly that owes itself to the Vocation system. Each Vocation has its own set of skills, and among them, some are more situational, and some are just downright ridiculously strong to the point where you sort of always have to use them if you're playing that Vocation. So today we are simply going to go over the best skill loadouts in Dragons Dogma 2 for each of the different Vocations, the strongest sort of combination of 4 skills for each one, and we'll also be ranking the classes along the way by these skills specifically just for a general judge of potency. Starting at the low end then, at 10th strongest we have the Trickster. With Dragon's Delusion, its strongest individual skill, it is able to get a full stagger on larger enemies or bosses and even cause smaller enemies to just sort of flee fights entirely. Then there's also Aromatic Resurgence for a buff that drains allies' health a little bit, but also gives them a notable damage buff and prevents them from dying if they are going to drain below 0 health. This is both great to actually just boost damage during the knockdowns granted by the dragon, and to keep allies alive through certain abilities. Past that, you almost always want Elusive Divider, which is the skill that creates a fake wall that enemies have to obey. This both can create essentially one-way shields where your allies attack through it, but the enemy can't attack back, and it can just completely protect you one side of it if you are surrounded. Just extremely strong. Then your last slot is a bit more flexible. I personally like Suffocating Shroud just for a large AoE threat control, but Trickster has a number of situationally strong options in this slot as well. You may be asking, why are you saying that if it's 10th on the list? And the answer is, it simply can't really apply damage itself. It has to rely on pawns for all of the damage no matter how you build it. Following that then, on our way up the chain, I've got the Archer, whose strongest skill is Tempest Shot. This just fires at a ridiculously rapid firing barrage of arrows at the targeted location, and this is fantastic in its own right for sure, essentially just the highest damage per second skill that Archer can reach naturally, but then it also has a lot of combo abilities and synergy with things like Sorcerer's Augural Flare, which you can have on a pawn of course, so it has a lot of utility past just its base existence. Manifold Shot then is a similar move that fires a bit less frequently for a bit less damage, but can be used while moving, which is extremely important, as this lets you just sort of avoid attacks while still applying loads of damage. And then you have your more supportist options past that: Cascade Shot for a multi-target close range, Lycian Sight for longer range shots, or even Erupting Shot for high knockdown power and damage if you place it on the weak spot. Then moving up again we have Mage, and Mage is one of the more open ones as there is just a ton of useful options that you could argue for. The first question is, does your weapon have innate element on it? If no, then you want boons, or affinities, the upgraded version. These add on a ton of damage to each attack that you do, so they are nearly required to have in a party somewhere, and while usually you would only want 1 slot for a specific boon, you could argue even having 3 slots for different elemental options while you're adventuring, so you just have access to the strongest element for the most situations possible. That said, if your weapons all have innate elements, then suddenly those boons are useless, so Celestial Pain, the legendary skill, is also a near auto-include, as it prevents stamina loss in the area while active, and that synergizes extremely well with pretty much every other vocation. High Palladium is also nearly universally good, giving everyone around you a shield that just blocks a hit of damage each time that you cast it. And there's just a bunch of other great skills for your last slot too. Things like High Celerity that basically just give you haste for a speed boost. There's quite a lot of good options here. After that we have the Fighter, which while it can deal some nice damage, its main role is really controlling the battlefield both with crowd control and with direct tanking. Shield Drum is invaluable for mob control, and then you also have Riotous Fury, the legendary skill, which is great for pure DPS, and that's excellent to have too. That said, Fighter's main role is tank, and after you Shield Drum to grab attention, you can then bust out one of my favorite skills, Flawless Guard, a skill that makes you basically just spin on the spot, blocking attacks from every direction and flinching any enemy that you hit in the meantime. What this essentially is then is just a full of safety area of effect knockdown power machine that lets you Beyblade through the middle of a pack of enemies and just be unable to be damaged while making the enemy unable to defend against your pawns as well. For your final slot, there's a lot more of sort of niche or situational utility options that you could put there, or you can just pick something like Blink Strike that I particularly like to close gaps, which is always quite valuable. Next up is Warrior, and this is one of my main vocations, so I've messed around with it quite a lot. The best general use setup is Indomitable Lash, which is just an extremely strong high damage attack with a bit of a longer charge time, and you also want Mountain Breaker, which is if you target a weak spot with this, you will get a massive amount of knockdown damage done to it, especially against larger enemies like bosses. This can create massive openings where you can fully knock bosses over, and then Indomitable Lash takes advantage of these openings when you hit the weak spots with it, and that's the main combo really. Your other 2 choices for this are a bit more malleable then, though my personal opinion is the best 2 to slot in are Ravening Lunge, which is just a hefty movement skill charging forwards for the entire length of your stamina bar unless you stop it ahead of time, that will also pick up any smaller enemies that you hit with it, and then if you hit a wall with an enemy stuck on your weapon, it will do bonus damage and stun them. Or you can even use this to throw them off of cliffs or ledges of any any kind. Then there's also Tidal Wrath, quite simply a parry that can parry any attack in the game, so a really high skill cap survival tool that also has a really high damage follow-up if you are successful with it. Everything else is situational really, so this loadout covers pretty much every base that you could really need. From here we are moving on from things that are just sort of solidly good into the realm of, okay, maybe that's a little bit overpowered. And in 5th place we have Sorcerer, whose main skill is Augural Flare. There are ways to build around this, but no matter what you do, the basis is always sort of the flare. This lets you apply basically a debuff to a specific part of an enemy that, when damaged, will pile up explosive power that then detonates after a short duration. The relative power of this is insane when paired with particularly fast-hitting abilities, because the actual damage scales with the amount of hits that are taken, not with the amount of damage. So the best real combo that Sorcerer has itself is the skill Maelstrom, the legendary skill, though it is extremely difficult to sort of put them together properly due to cast times and stamina costs. However, I recommend taking Maelstrom anyways most of the time, just because it's strong in its own right too. Past that, you want Spell Hold, which lets you cast a spell ahead of time and then hold it for later to release it quicker. Mostly this will just be used specifically for Augural Flare, so you can just sort of combo one flare into another one, using the explosions from one to fuel the second, and the last one is a bit more flexible, but high Frigor is the best option really, both coming with movement utility and also being a nice low cast time, high damage, area of effect skill as well. In 4th then, I've got Mystic Spearhand with their absolutely busted defensive ability, Mirror Shield. This creates a barrier on you and all nearby allies that completely negates all damage for a short duration, which is up to 10 seconds, by the way, with the advanced version of the skill. So essentially, if you cast this once every 10 seconds, and it costs far too low stamina for that to actually be an issue to do, you and all nearby pawns are fully immortal, at which point you could be doing peanuts for damage. It doesn't really matter because you can never really lose a fight in the game again with this skill being used properly. But there are also vocations that can just sort of kill enemies so quickly that they never even have the chance to take damage, which is why this sits in 4th. The other abilities then that you would want to combine with build for this to make the Spearhand the best it can be then are Dragoon's Foin, mostly just for the combined movement utility that you can use in various situations and the damage that it does, Wild Fury, which is just an incredibly high damage per second skill that you can hit repeatedly, just sort of attack the monster just over and over again if you get the openings for it. And the last slot is somewhat malleable. You could go for the dive attack for more damage, you could spec into a bit more of your range damage options instead, but my personal preference is Ravener's Hand, which lets you just straight up drain stamina from your enemies whenever you get low. Up in 3rd then I have Magick Archer, which has the strongest pure offense ability in the game, Martyrs Bolt. This legendary skill absorbs your health and fills your loss gauge while charging it, so the cost is massive, but if you charge it with a near full health bar, it can one-shot pretty much every boss in the game. Literally one skill usage for a kill. It is intensely high risk, high reward, of course, as after doing that you will have like no health left and no real ability to actually recover it, but the reward is unquestionably massive, so it is nearly always worth having around for emergency situations. Next up then is Recovery Arrow. This can heal pawns and can even revive them when fully charged, letting you just keep pawns stable from a distance, which no other vocation can. Then you also have Sagittate Avalanche, which is just the strongest damage heal that isn't Martyr's Bolt for this class, that also synergizes extremely well with Augural Flare on a pawn, and is just an extremely high fire rate burst of arrows fired. Then your final slot is much more malleable. I'm personally a really big fan of Bolt Chain Strike for general open world exploring, as it can apply a lot of crowd control to larger groups. Arctic Bolt is incredibly good for single target damage, and it also applies a buttload of stagger when you hit weak spots with it too. Then if you want to go more support sided, you could take Life-Taking Arrow, which is a piercing shot that drains health from enemies and gives it not only to your pawns, but also to you yourself, which is pretty neat too. But then there's also Ricochet Hunter, which is just absolutely nuts if you're doing any sort of indoor content at all, with walls or roofs or in close proximity of any kind with enemies in it, but it is sort of useless outside of that, so it's definitely extremely niche, but it's also extremely strong and fun. The final one that I really want to shout out here is Soporific Bolt, which can put nearly any enemy in the game to sleep in a couple of hits, and you can of course use that to combo with Martyr's Bolt for a massive finish. Then in second I've got the Thief, which honestly shouldn't surprise a singular person. The first skill is also probably unsurprisingly Skull Splitter. This move just does an incredible amount of damage. It dodges lower attacks, and it has an insanely fast hit rate that makes it essentially the best pairing for Augural Flare in the game, leading to pretty much one-shotting most bosses in the game if you just Skull Split into an Augural Flare. Then past that you have Formless Feint, which makes you automatically dodge any incoming damage while active, and then you combo that further with Blades of the Pyre, which makes you, well, explode. But the fun thing is these things interact together, and so with Formless Feint, you dodge your own explosions so you don't take damage from them or get flinched by them, but still do massive damage to enemies that are nearby. And this is just extremely fun and powerful by itself too. Then your final slot is a bit more open. Generally I'd suggest picking just one of your movement oriented skills in general, just so you can get around the battlefield a little bit quicker, but it's mostly personal choice. And then we have number 1, which without a doubt is Warfare with the rearmament skill at the top. Maybe you consider this a bit of a cheesy answer, but I think this is just sort of extremely logical. Of all the ridiculously strong skills I've been talking about today, only a few of them really are legendary skills, and rearmament lets you use any combination of 3 non-legendary skills in the entire game in your other slots, regardless of vocation that they are attached to naturally. This means that you can use things like Augural Flare and Skull Splitter on your own character for overpowered nutso builds, and you could even put them together with like Mirrored Shield in that last skill slot, and now you become literally unkillable while also being able to apply your own flares that do detonation damage depending on number of hits taken, with your third skill being the fastest attack in the entire game. It just undeniably creates the best possible synergy on a singular character. It lets you accomplish all of this without having to rely on pawn AI for any of it, which is what makes it the best. As simple as that. That just about does it for today then, everyone. Just a full ranking list of vocations by their best ability loadouts as well for a bit of fun to get to talk about what I think are best things are for each one's and why and how I think they compare to each other for various reasons. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and of course if you have any other thoughts on the subject, feel free to leave them down below in the comments of the video. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.